What if I told you that before human history even began, Earth was ruled by just 8 kings, and their reign lasted for more than 241,000 years? This isn't a fantasy novel or a myth whispered through ancient temples. It's written word for word in one of the oldest documents ever discovered, an ancient Sumerian record that names each of these immortal rulers. We're talking about kings who ruled for 28,000 years, 36,000 years, and even longer. They watched entire ages rise and fall under their command, moving their capitals across a prehistoric world until it all came crashing down in one devastating event, the Great Flood. The story we all know as the beginning of civilization might not have been the beginning at all. It might have been the end of something far greater. Everything you've been taught about the dawn of civilization is probably wrong. The timeline you learned in school, the neat one that begins about 6,000 years ago with the first cities and the invention of writing, may only be the final chapter of a much older, stranger, and far more epic story. And the proof of this hidden age isn't buried in some secret vault or guarded by mysterious organizations. It's been sitting quietly in a museum for over a century, etched onto a small clay prism no bigger than a paperback book. This artifact, called the Weld Blundell prism, looks ordinary, a simple block of baked clay covered in tiny wedge-shaped markings. But it's not what it seems, because what's written on its surface completely shatters our understanding of human history. This document, known as the Sumerian King List, doesn't hint or suggest that our history is older than we think. It states it directly, with cold, factual precision. Before a great flood swept over the earth, it says, 8 kings ruled humanity for a staggering 241 years. 8 rulers, 241,000 years. If that's true, if this ancient text is even partially accurate, then everything we think we know about civilization collapses. If this artifact is authentic in its intent, it rewrites our entire origin story. Our timeline, our science, our belief in gradual human progress, all of it would have to be re-examined. Because if 8 kings ruled for hundreds of millennia before the flood, then humanity's story doesn't begin in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago. It begins in an age so far back it almost disappears into myth, and yet this isn't a myth. It's a record, carved in clay by a civilization that invented writing itself. If the Sumerian King List is real, then it means history as we know it might just be the epilogue of a much greater saga. Prepare yourselves, because what you're about to hear could change the way you see human civilization forever. Let's rewind to the year 1922, in what is now modern-day Iraq. The sun burned over the ancient plains as a British archaeological team, led by Herbert Weld Blundell, dug through the ruins of a long-forgotten Sumerian city called Larsa. They were searching for tablets, hymns, or trade records, the kind of everyday documents archaeologists often found buried in ancient Mesopotamia. But what they uncovered that day was something completely unexpected. Among the rubble and dust, they discovered a small, four-sided clay prism covered from top to bottom in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of the Sumerians. At first glance, it didn't look extraordinary. To the untrained eye, it could have been any administrative record from the cradle of civilization, perhaps a list of goods, offerings, or temple duties. But when scholars began translating it, their excitement turned to confusion. The writing wasn't poetry or mythology. It wasn't about harvests or battles. It was a list, a meticulously organized record that named kings, their cities, and the length of their reigns. The tone wasn't grand or mythical. It was clinical, like an accountant's log. Each line followed the same formula, a king's name, his city, and his reign measured in years. And then came the shock. The numbers weren't hundreds or even thousands. They were tens of thousands. The first ruler, Alulim of Eridu, was said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alulgar, ruled for 36,000. The list went on, naming 8 kings in total, each ruling for an impossible span of time, all before a single haunting line broke the rhythm. Then the flood swept over. To modern readers, the meaning was clear. This wasn't a record of ordinary men. The idea of anyone ruling for tens of thousands of years seemed absurd, impossible. Naturally, early historians dismissed it as myth, a creation story meant to glorify Sumer's past. Yet the prism held a secret that made dismissal difficult. Because after that simple sentence, after the flood, the list continued. It named new kings, new cities, and their reigns were suddenly shorter. Hundreds of years, then mere decades, and here's where the paradox appeared. The kings mentioned after the flood weren't legends. They were real. Archaeologists had already found records, inscriptions, and ruins confirming their existence. Kings like Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose city walls still stand today. The same scribe who recorded the reign of Gilgamesh also wrote of the kings who lived for 43,000 years. The same hand, the same tone, the same document. So how could one part of the text be considered fact and the other dismissed as fiction? The Weld-Blundell prism presented a contradiction that no historian could easily solve. Either the scribe believed both sections to be true, or the line between myth and history was far thinner than we've ever imagined. What if civilization wasn't invented, but delivered? What if humanity didn't climb its way up from chaos, but was pulled up, shaped, organized, and instructed by something far beyond itself? That's the claim hidden in the ancient Sumerian King List. It doesn't begin with humans learning how to rule. It begins with a single world-changing line. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. To the Sumerians, kingship wasn't a human idea. It was a gift, a divine technology given to Earth. The story of human progress, that slow climb from hunter-gatherer to farmer to city builder, is the foundation of everything we've been taught. It's the story of evolution, of survival, of trial and error. But the Sumerians told a different story, one that starts at the top. They believed that government, science, mathematics, even morality came fully formed, not from human invention, but from the heavens. Think about what that implies. For generations, we've imagined early humans huddled in caves, struggling to plant seeds, learning by accident how to smelt metal or count the stars. Yet the archaeological record shows something strange. Civilization in Sumer didn't appear slowly. It exploded into existence. Within a few centuries, a region that had been little more than farming villages suddenly produced written language, legal systems, irrigation networks, monumental temples, and complex astronomy. There are no primitive steps, no clear evolution. It's as if someone flipped a switch. The King List explains this sudden leap in a single phrase: kingship descended from heaven. It doesn't describe a gradual invention of leadership. It describes a transmission. Imagine a world where an entire structure, government, religion, law, science, was handed down like a download. The Sumerians received an operating system for civilization, and from that system, everything else grew. It's a radical idea. But the pattern isn't unique to Sumer. We find the same story repeated in almost every ancient culture on Earth. In Egypt, the pharaohs claimed to rule by divine decree. They weren't men chosen by the people. They were living gods, the earthly form of Horus, the son of Ra, the sun god. In China, the emperors ruled through the mandate of heaven, a divine authorization that could be granted or taken away depending on the ruler's virtue. In India, kingship was tied to Dharma, a sacred cosmic law. In Japan, the emperor's bloodline was said to come directly from the sun goddess Amitarisu. And across the ocean in the highlands of Peru, the Inca emperors claimed descent from Inti, the god of the sun, whose children came down to teach humanity how to live. Different cultures, different languages, yet all telling the same story. Rule came from above, order came from above, knowledge came from above. Why would so many separate civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, invent the exact same idea, that their rulers were chosen not by men, but by the gods? The simplest answer might be the most unsettling one. Maybe it wasn't invention at all. Maybe it was memory. If the Sumerian account is true, civilization didn't emerge from the ground up. It was installed from the top down, like software written by someone else. Think of humanity as a computer before the first boot up, raw, functional but blank. Then one day the system was turned on. A new code was loaded. Kingship, law, language, architecture, astronomy, all part of the same program. The installation didn't take millennia. It happened suddenly, and once it began, every civilization that came after it ran on the same basic design. Even the language of ancient myth supports this metaphor. The gods descend. Knowledge is bestowed. Wisdom is granted. The same verbs repeat across continents, suggesting not invention, but transmission. The Sumerians said Enki gave them the Me, divine decrees, containing the blueprint of civilization. The Egyptians said Thoth gifted them writing and numbers. The Greeks said Prometheus stole fire and gave it to man. The Aztecs said Quetzalcoatl brought agriculture and learning. All these stories describe a moment when knowledge arrives fully formed, not discovered but delivered. If we see these myths not as fantasy, but as distorted memories of real events, the implications are staggering. It would mean that human civilization is not self-created, but inherited. Our first kings weren't self-appointed warlords. They were managers of a system already in place, appointees chosen to run a program designed elsewhere. Imagine a small group of advanced beings. Call them gods, call them teachers, call them visitors, arriving on a young earth. They look at scattered tribes and chaos, and they decide to impose order. They teach language so people can communicate. They teach measurement so they can build. They teach law so they can obey. And then they leave, trusting humanity to maintain the system. Over time, the system fragments. The memory fades. The gods become myths, their technology becomes magic, and their administrators become kings. It's an extraordinary theory, but it explains the great puzzle of Sumer. How did a civilization that supposedly emerged from Stone Age farmers create writing, mathematics, and city planning overnight? How did they measure the stars with such precision that modern astronomy still uses their base 60 system to track time and angles? These aren't the achievements of a society learning from scratch. They're the signs of one that started already knowing the answers. And perhaps that's why the Sumerians insisted that kingship descended from heaven. To them, kingship wasn't just government. It was the foundation of civilization itself. Everything, art, religion, science, trade, revolved around it. The king wasn't simply a ruler. He was the bridge between heaven and earth, the living interface between the human and the divine. Now think about how deeply this idea shaped our world. Every empire that followed, from Babylon to Rome, from the pharaohs to the Ming dynasty, carried the same belief that power flows downward. Even in our modern world, where monarchs are mostly symbolic, the architecture of authority remains the same. Presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, they sit at the top of pyramids built thousands of years ago. The pattern of kingship, first recorded on that Sumerian prism, still defines how our societies operate. So what if this divine right wasn't just a political idea, but a design feature? What if hierarchy itself, the urge to organize, to obey, to centralize power, is part of the original code? We think of evolution as random, but this structure feels deliberate. It's too consistent, too universal, too ancient to be an accident. The Sumerian King List doesn't just describe rulers who lived for tens of thousands of years. It describes a world that was already complete. It tells us that civilization began not with discovery, but with instruction. Someone, or something, gave us the tools, and we've been using them ever since. Across continents, the same message echoes. Knowledge came down from the sky. It may have been expressed in different languages, under different names, but the meaning never changed. Humanity did not invent civilization. Civilization was given to humanity. If that's true, then our history is not the story of progress. It's the story of inheritance. We are not pioneers standing at the peak of evolution. We are caretakers, maintaining a system we barely understand, a system written long before our first words were carved in clay. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still look up when we pray, why we still search the skies for answers, and why, after thousands of years, the oldest line in human history still feels like a command written into our DNA. Kingship descended from heaven. Long before the world we know, before Egypt, before Babylon, before even the idea of history, there was Eridu, the first city ever built. The Sumerians said it wasn't built by men at all, but by gods. They called it Enun, House of the Mighty Lord. It stood near the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, where rivers met the sea. To them, this was where heaven touched the earth. When the gods decided that humanity was ready to be ruled, they sent kingship down from the heavens. And the first to receive it was Alulim of Eridu. His name means stag of the floods, and the King List claims he ruled for 28,800 years. That number seems impossible, but to the Sumerians, it wasn't just a measurement. It was a sign of divinity. It meant Alulim didn't belong entirely to this world. He was the first bridge between men and gods. Under Alulim's reign, order replaced chaos. The people of Eridu learned to organize, to build temples of mud brick, to record time by the movement of stars. They discovered the rhythm of the seasons, the flood, and the harvest. Alulim was said to have received the tablets of destiny, heavenly instructions on how to build a world that would last. He brought law, ritual, and the very first concept of kingship, not as power, but as sacred duty. The stories say that Alulim did not die. He simply returned to the waters when his time was over, leaving his throne to Alalgar, the second king of Eridu, who reigned for 36,000 years. Alalgar's age was remembered as one of perfection, the golden refinement of creation. If Alulim had shaped the structure, Alalgar brought harmony. Under him, the gods walked openly among men. The air shimmered with their presence. The temples of Eridu rang with hymns that praised Enki, the god of wisdom, who lived beneath the city in the Abzu, the deep freshwater sea that symbolized the source of all life. Eridu's people believed that everything, knowledge, language, numbers, even justice, came from Enki's domain, and Alalgar was his chosen administrator on earth. The myths describe him as a teacher king who taught humankind the laws of balance, how to measure fairness, how to judge disputes, how to build with precision. His palace was not of gold, but of symbols, every brick aligned to the stars, every hall an echo of the heavens. During this long age, humanity learned more than survival. It learned design. The first irrigation channels were dug, the first temples raised, the first astronomers recorded the paths of the planets. Civilization had begun. Then, after 36,000 years of peace and perfection, the record shifts again. The tablet says only one line, simple but immense. Then kingship was taken from Eridu and carried to Bad Tibira. The tone is emotionless, like a transfer of files from one city to another, but the meaning is cosmic. It wasn't just that a new king took power. The entire system of civilization moved. Eridu's era of spiritual order was ending. A new age defined by craft, invention, and the mastery of matter was about to begin. Bad Tibira means the fortress of metal. If Eridu was the city of divine order, Bad Tibira was the city of creation, a place where gods and humans worked side by side to shape the raw materials of the world. Here the Sumerians believed the art of metallurgy was born. The forges of Bad Tibira glowed day and night, and from their fires came tools, weapons, and the first symbols of industry. The first king of this new city was Enmenluana, who ruled for 43,200 years. His name means Lord of the Abundant People. Under his guidance, the Sumerians said humanity learned how to build in stone and bronze. Enmenluana's age was the time of builders, when the first ziggurats were raised as stairways for the gods. The sound of hammers echoed across the plain, and humans discovered how to shape the world instead of merely living in it. Next came Enmen-Gal-Ana, whose reign lasted 28,800 years. His name can be translated as Great Lord of All. If his predecessor built the bones of civilization, Enmen-Gal-Ana clothed it in beauty. His era was said to be one of prosperity and music, when the arts flourished, and the calendar, the great measurement of time itself, was perfected. Priests studied the stars, recording eclipses and cycles. Scribes developed new cuneiform signs. For the first time, humanity began to understand not only how to survive, but how to thrive. Then came Dumuzid the shepherd, ruler of Bad Tibira for 36,000 years. You may recognize his name. Later myths transformed him into Tammuz, the god of fertility and rebirth. In the earliest legends, however, he was a real king, a guardian who walked between the living and the divine. Dumuzid's reign represented the age of connection between earth and heaven. He was loved by the people for his gentleness and wisdom, and stories say flocks multiplied wherever he walked. But even paradise has its end. Dumuzid's fall is one of the most haunting in all ancient literature. He was taken by the gods to the underworld, some say as punishment, others say as sacrifice, to renew the earth. His descent symbolized the first death of a divine king, a warning that even immortal reigns could end. His wife, the goddess Inanna, tried to bring him back, descending into the land of the dead. When she returned, half the world mourned and half rejoiced. From that myth came the idea of the seasons, life and death, creation and decay, forever cycling. With Dumuzid's fall, the kingdom of Bad Tibira lost its favor. The texts say, then kingship was taken from Bad Tibira and carried to Larak. Civilization shifted again. The fire of the forge dimmed, and the age of wisdom gave way to the age of watchfulness. The third city, Larak, is shrouded in mystery. Its ruins have never been found, yet the King List records it clearly. Its sole ruler was Inscribed, who reigned for 28,800 years. His name means shepherd of the heavens, and his reign is described as one of vigilance. The age of Larak was said to be a time when humans began to look outward, studying the skies not only for omens, but for understanding. Astronomers built great observatories of clay and stone, tracking stars that guided planting, sailing, and ritual. The Sumerians called them the Watchers. But knowledge brings both power and danger. As the people of Larak grew wiser, they also grew proud. Myths speak of disputes among the gods, of envy and of warnings ignored. The harmony of Eridu and Bad Tibira began to unravel. The divine software that had run perfectly for thousands of years started to glitch. Then kingship moved again, this time to Sippar, ruled by Enmen-Dur-Ana, whose reign lasted 21,000 years. He is perhaps the most fascinating of them all because his story mirrors that of a later biblical figure, Enoch. Like Enoch, Enmen-Dur-Ana was said to have been taken up to heaven without dying. The gods loved him for his wisdom, and they revealed to him the secrets of the sun, the moon, and the stars. He was taught the art of reading the movements of time itself. He returned to earth with divine knowledge, bringing mathematics, geometry, and the sacred calendar that measured the heavens. In Sippar, civilization reached its intellectual peak. The people mapped the constellations, calculated eclipses, and understood that their lives were woven into celestial cycles. It was an age of enlightenment, but also of hubris. Humanity now possessed the wisdom of the gods, and that made it dangerous. The final kingdom before the flood was Shurupak, ruled by Ubara-Tutu, who reigned for 18,600 years. His name means the light of the foundation. Under his rule, Shurupak became a center of culture and power. It was here that the great libraries of pre-flood knowledge were said to have been stored, clay tablets containing the instructions of heaven. Ubara-Tutu's son, Zeus Sudra, would later be known to the world by another name, Noah, But something had gone wrong. The King List tells us simply, then the flood swept over. That single line marks the end of an era that lasted nearly 250,000 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, countless generations, gone in a heartbeat. According to the Sumerians, the flood was not a random disaster. It was a reset. The gods had seen that the order they had given was being corrupted. Humanity, once obedient, had become proud and reckless. The divine program had to be wiped clean so that a new version could begin. And so the flood came, washing away the cities, the temples, the towers, and the memory of the Golden Age. When the waters finally receded, only one man survived, Ziusudra of Shuruppak, the last descendant of the pre-flood kings. He carried the knowledge of the old world into the new. After the flood, the King List says, kingship descended again from heaven. But the new kings were different. Their reigns were measured not in tens of thousands of years, but in mere centuries. The age of gods had ended. The age of men had begun. And then it happened. The Sumerian King List ends its grand sequence of immortal reigns with a single, chilling line. Then the flood swept over. No description, no battle, no prophecy, just silence, a pause that feels like the end of the world. That single sentence marks the moment when everything changed. The cities of Eridu, Badtibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, the shining pillars of the gods, were gone. The long reigns of the divine kings ended, and with them vanished the ancient order that had shaped the earth for 200 years. It was the moment the divine world withdrew, and humanity stood alone. The flood wasn't just a story to the Sumerians. It was memory, an event so devastating that it became etched into the soul of nearly every civilization that followed. The same memory appears in the Bible, in India, in Greece, in the Americas. Across every culture, the same words echo: a world drowned, a chosen survivor, and a new beginning. In Sumer, the survivor was Ziusudra, the life of long days. In Babylonian texts, he becomes Utnapishtim. In Hebrew scripture, he becomes Noah. In Hindu legend, he is Manu, saved by a god in the form of a fish. In Greece, he is Deucalion, who rides out the storm in a chest. In all these tales, the pattern is the same. Divine warning, a great vessel, a flood that destroys everything, and a dawn of a new world. Could all these myths be describing the same real event? Archaeologists once thought the flood was just a legend, a metaphor for renewal. But in the early 20th century, excavations in southern Mesopotamia began to tell another story. At ancient Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish, diggers found thick layers of clean clay, up to 8 feet deep, sitting between layers of civilization. Beneath them, older cities lay buried. Above them, new cities had risen. Something had wiped out entire cultures, suddenly and completely, leaving behind only silt and silence. To the Sumerians, this was the flood the gods sent to reset humanity. To modern science, it might have been one of the greatest natural disasters in history. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth entered what scientists call the Younger Dryas, a sudden, catastrophic cooling period that ended the last ice age. Some researchers believe a massive comet or asteroid struck the planet, triggering global fires, floods, and climate collapse. Others argue it was a series of meltwater bursts from retreating glaciers, causing ocean levels to rise hundreds of feet. In either case, the result was the same: chaos. Entire coastlines disappeared. Animal species vanished overnight. Human populations scattered. The world before the flood, whatever it looked like, was gone. If the Sumerian King List preserves the memory of this event, then the flood wasn't just symbolic. It was the dividing line between two ages, the age of the gods and the age of men. Before it, kings lived for tens of thousands of years. After it, they lived for hundreds. The connection to the divine was broken. The text of the King List reflects this transition perfectly. Before the flood, the numbers are vast, cosmic, impossible. After the flood, the figures shrink. Lifespans collapse. The power of kings becomes earthly, limited. It's as if a curtain fell between heaven and earth. The flood wasn't just the destruction of cities, it was the erasure of memory. Imagine a civilization so advanced that it had mastered astronomy, architecture, and engineering, all wiped away in a single generation. The survivors remembered fragments, stories of the old gods, faint echoes of lost wisdom. Over time, those memories became myths, and those myths became religion. But in the silence after the flood, something else changed, something deeper. Humanity began to fear time. Before the flood, kings measured their reigns in millennia. They saw themselves as part of eternity. After the flood, life became brief, fragile, uncertain. The Sumerians were the first to describe the human condition as the sorrow of days that end. For the first time, people understood death as final. The divine bloodline was gone. Ziusudra, the last king before the waters came, was said to have been granted immortality by the gods as a reward for preserving life. He was taken to live at the mouth of the rivers, where he would never die. To later generations, that became paradise, a hidden realm at the world's edge where the last of the old gods waited. It was both a promise and a warning that immortality was not for mankind anymore. The flood had changed the rules. The question is, what caused it? Geologists studying the end of the Ice Age have found shocking evidence of sudden, massive floods all over the world. Giant boulders carried hundreds of miles, ancient riverbeds scoured into canyons, and buried coastlines lying deep beneath today's seas. In the Black Sea, researchers discovered evidence of a violent flood around 7000 BCE, when rising waters from the Mediterranean poured through the Bosporus and drowned thousands of square miles of land. To the people living there, it must have felt like the end of the world. Further west, in North America, the Missoula floods unleashed torrents of water that reshaped entire valleys. In the Middle East, the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, may have overflowed catastrophically, submerging ancient cities overnight. Perhaps these regional events were remembered collectively, merging over centuries into one universal story, the Great Flood. But what if it wasn't only natural? Some researchers, both ancient and modern, suggest that the flood was not just a consequence of nature, but a decision. The Sumerians themselves said the gods had decreed it. They gathered in council, disturbed by how mankind had grown noisy, how humans had become reckless and arrogant. Enlil, the chief god, declared that humanity would be erased, while Enki, the god of wisdom, secretly warned one righteous man, Ziusudra, to build a vessel and save life from destruction. It's a story of judgment, but also mercy. The gods wiped the slate clean, yet they allowed one seed of life to survive. That seed became the new humanity, the one we descend from. If we strip away the names and divine imagery, what remains is a story of survival, the oldest one we have. A species that lost everything but memory, starting again in a shattered world. And maybe that's why the flood story exists in every culture. Because deep down, we all remember. Whether it was a comet, a superstorm, or divine wrath, something truly world-changing happened in our past. Something that almost erased us. The flood is more than an event. It's the scar that separates the mythic from the mortal. It marks the moment when the gods stopped walking among us and began living only in our stories. When the waters receded, the world that emerged was smaller, humbler, quieter. The first kings of the new era ruled not for 30,000 years, but for 300. They were mortal men, not shining immortals. The bond between heaven and earth, once a bridge, was now a memory. Once a bridge was now a memory. The flood was a reset, a divine reboot. The world we know today, our cities, our languages, our faiths, all grew from the survivors of that ancient cataclysm. The pre-flood world, with its impossible lifespans and godlike rulers, became myth. But maybe it wasn't myth at all. Maybe it was simply another version of the world, one that existed before the last great shutdown. Even now, thousands of years later, the echoes remain. Every major religion speaks of a lost paradise, a divine fall, a judgment by water. Every ancient people looked at their ruined temples and broken tablets and wondered, what came before us? The flood was not just the end of the old world. It was the beginning of ours, and perhaps that's why the Sumerians ended their record with that single haunting line. Because sometimes history doesn't end with an explosion. It ends with water. Then the flood swept over. When the floodwaters finally receded, the world was empty and silent. The land that had once been bright with temples and towers was now a wasteland of mud and broken stone. The Sumerians believed that humanity itself had nearly vanished, that only one man, Ziusudra of Shuruppak, had survived by divine command, carrying the seed of life in a great vessel. The King List continues, in its calm and measured tone. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended again from heaven. That single sentence marked the rebirth of civilization. But it was a different kind of world now, a smaller, humbler, mortal world. The kings who came after the flood did not reign for tens of thousands of years. Their lifespans dropped sharply, from millennia to centuries, then to decades. The age of gods had ended. The age of men had begun. The first post-flood dynasty rose in the city of Kish. The King List names Jusha as its founder, ruling for 200 years. It still sounds impossible, but compared to the reigns before the flood, it's already closer to human scale. After him came Etana, a name that echoes through Sumerian legend. Etana was known as the shepherd who ascended to heaven. The stories say he was chosen by the gods to restore balance on earth. Desperate for an heir, Etana prayed to Shamash, the sun god, who sent an eagle to carry him to the heavens. High above the clouds, Etana glimpsed the realm of the gods, a place of eternal light, before he was cast back down. His tale symbolizes mankind's first attempt to rise again, to reach the divine heights that had been lost after the flood. But this new humanity was different. The bond between heaven and earth had weakened. The divine kings were gone. The world was now ruled by mortals who carried only a shadow of that old power. They still spoke of the gods, still built temples, still dreamed of eternity, but their lives were brief, their memories fragile. The Sumerians understood this loss deeply. In their epics, they described it as a kind of heartbreak, the great separation between creator and creation. The gods no longer walked among men. They could be worshipped but not seen. They could be prayed to but not touched. And it's in this quiet, mourning world that one of history's greatest figures appears. Gilgamesh of Uruk. His name is carved not only in myth, but in stone. Archaeologists have uncovered his city walls, his temple foundations, and inscriptions that bear his name. Gilgamesh was real, a king who ruled around 2800 BCE, yet his legend, written centuries later on clay tablets, tells a story that feels larger than life, the final echo of the world before the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known heroic tale on earth. It begins not with a god, but with a man, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, ruling a city that had become too proud. Gilgamesh was mighty, wise, and restless. He built the walls of Uruk so strong that they still stand today. But his heart was filled with longing, a hunger not for conquest but for meaning. In Gilgamesh, we see humanity's first reflection of itself, powerful yet incomplete, mortal yet yearning for the eternal. He represents the bridge between the two worlds, the divine perfection of the pre-flood kings and the fragile reality of human existence after. When his closest friend, Enkidu, died, Gilgamesh's world shattered. For the first time, a king confronted death not as myth, but as truth. He could no longer ignore mortality. His grief turned to obsession. He set out on a journey to find immortality, to escape the fate that even kings could no longer avoid. His quest led him across deserts and mountains, to the edge of the known world, and finally to the sea, where Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, lived in eternal peace. Utnapishtim told him the secret of life and death, how the gods had once granted him immortality for saving humanity, but had sworn never to give it again. Gilgamesh begged for the same gift. Utnapishtim tested him, asked him to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. But Gilgamesh failed. He fell asleep, proving that even the greatest of men cannot overcome human weakness. Before he left, Utnapishtim revealed one final secret, a plant that could restore youth. Gilgamesh found it, held it in his hands, and for a brief moment believed he had defeated death. But while he rested by a pool, a serpent rose from the water and stole it away. The serpent shed its skin and slithered back into the depths, reborn and ageless, while Gilgamesh stood powerless. Watching his last hope vanish, he returned to Uruk empty-handed. But when he saw the massive walls he had built, he finally understood. Immortality wasn't in living forever, it was in what we leave behind. His legacy, carved in stone, would outlast him. That realization marked the end of the divine dream and the beginning of human history. Gilgamesh's story isn't just myth. It's a mirror, a reflection of the great transition the Sumerians were living through. They were moving from the age of gods to the age of men, from immortality to mortality, from myth to history. And Gilgamesh stood at that crossroads, half divine but fully human, carrying the burden of memory from the world before the flood. What makes the story of Gilgamesh so extraordinary is that it unites the two great halves of our past, the mythic and the historical. The flood he seeks to understand, the immortal man he meets, the gods he defies, all come from the same tradition that produced the Sumerian King List. Yet Gilgamesh himself was real, his name etched into clay, his city unearthed by archaeologists thousands of years later. In him, myth and archaeology meet face to face. When we read his story today, we aren't just reading the world's first epic, we're reading the final chapter of the old world. Gilgamesh is the last echo of the gods who once ruled the earth, and the first voice of humanity learning to live without them. The Sumerians knew this. In their tablets they mourned not only for lost kings, but for lost connection. One ancient poem reads, "The gods kept immortality for themselves. They left death to mankind." That line captures the entire emotional weight of their civilization, a people who remembered a time when death was not inevitable, when rulers lived for tens of thousands of years, and when heaven and earth were one. After the flood, that unity was gone forever. The new kings were mortal. Their power came not from the heavens, but from human hands. They built cities, made laws, and ruled by strength and cunning, but none could escape time. Gilgamesh's failure to achieve immortality wasn't tragedy. It was truth. It was the moment humanity accepted its limits, and in doing so, discovered meaning. When he returned to Uruk, Gilgamesh didn't curse the gods. He stood upon the walls he had built and smiled. Because those walls, his creation, his legacy, were proof that humans could still touch eternity. Not by living forever, but by remembering, building, and telling stories. That is what separates us from the animals and connects us still, faintly, to the divine. The Sumerian King List begins with gods and ends with men. Between them lies the flood, the great dividing line. And standing right on that line is Gilgamesh, part myth, part man, the bridge between heaven and earth. He could not live forever, but his story did. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists uncovered his city, they found more than ruins. They found proof that myth and memory, faith and fact, were never truly separate. They were one continuous story, passed from the age of gods to the age of men. Gilgamesh's name still echoes through time because he represents all of us, striving, questioning, dreaming, failing, and still building. He was the first to ask the question that defines our species. If I must die, then what does it mean to live? And that question, born in the dust of ancient Sumer, still defines the human journey today. The story of the Sumerian kings might sound impossible, a myth buried in clay. But what makes it truly haunting is that it isn't unique. The same pattern, the same story repeats all over the world, in every ancient civilization, from the Nile to the Yangtze, from the Andes to the Pacific. There are stories of divine rulers, great floods and gods who once walked among men. Each culture tells it in its own language, but the melody is always the same. The Sumerians wrote, "Kingship descended from heaven." The Egyptians said, "The gods came forth from the stars to rule upon earth." The Chinese spoke of the mandate of heaven, authority granted by the cosmos itself. The Mayans said their kings were chosen by the sky serpent, born from the union of gods and humans. In Japan, emperors traced their bloodline directly to the sun goddess Amaterasu. In the Andes, the Inca claimed descent from Inti, the sun god who sent his children down to bring order to the world. And in the Bible, the book of Genesis describes the same line, written thousands of years later. There were giants in the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. It's as if every civilization remembered the same original event, a time when knowledge, power and kingship came not from human invention, but from the sky. In Egypt, the story begins with the Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods ruled directly over mankind. The list of early Egyptian kings, found on the Turin royal canon, mirrors the Sumerian King List almost exactly. It begins with divine beings ruling for thousands of years, followed by semi-divine rulers, and finally mortal pharaohs. According to their own records, the god Osiris reigned for 453 years, Horus for 300, Thoth for 3200. These are not myths told around fires. They are written, formal histories carved on temple walls across the Indian subcontinent. The Vedic texts describe vast ages called yugas, where gods, demigods, and humans shared the earth. The first of these, Satya Yuga, lasted for 1.7 million years, a golden age where rulers lived for tens of thousands of years. As time moved forward, each yuga grew shorter, lifespans shrank, and virtue faded, just as the Sumerian King List describes the divine era collapsing into mortal history. Even in China, far from Mesopotamia, the ancient chronicles tell the same tale. Before the known dynasties, there were the 3 august ones and 5 emperors, godlike figures who reigned for centuries, teaching humanity agriculture, writing, medicine, and astronomy. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, was said to have descended from the heavens on a dragon chariot of light. His court, the legends say, was filled with beings who could live for hundreds of years and command the elements themselves. In Mesoamerica, the Maya, Aztec, and Toltec all shared the memory of a radiant teacher who came from the east, a man with shining skin and great wisdom, who brought the knowledge of time, the calendar, and the stars. His name was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was not born of earth, but descended from the sky to bring civilization to humankind. And when his work was done, he promised to return. In the high Andes, the Inca told nearly the same story. They said that before their empire, the world was chaos, until Viracocha, a bearded god clothed in white, emerged from the waters and brought light to the world. He taught humans how to build, how to plant, how to rule, and then vanished across the Pacific, walking on the waves. And even in the islands of the Pacific, in Polynesia, the Maori, and the tribes of Micronesia, the pattern remains. Sky gods come down to instruct mankind, rule for countless generations, and then disappear after a great flood or catastrophe. The names change, Tangaroa, Cain, Kanaloa, but the memory is identical. From Africa to Europe, from the Americas to Asia, ancient peoples spoke of the same things. An age before the flood, a race of gods or beings who ruled the earth, a great disaster that destroyed everything, a survivor who carried life forward, a rebirth, and the decline of divine power. Different languages, different lands, one collective memory. Modern historians call these mythic parallels. They say that ancient peoples simply created similar stories to explain the same natural events: the rising of rivers, the power of kings, the terror of death. But when you line up the details, the similarities are too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Why do so many cultures, separated by oceans, with no contact for thousands of years, share the same timeline? The same sequence of divine rule, flood, and human kingship? Why does every one of them measure time in grand cycles, not centuries, but epochs? Why do they all say the same thing? That once humanity lived among gods and then lost them? Could these be fragments of a shared memory, the echo of a real event so ancient, so vast, that it shaped every civilization that came after? Even their symbols seem to connect. The Sumerians spoke of the me, the divine blueprints of civilization given by the gods. In Egypt, they called them the books of Thoth. In India, they were the Vedas, knowledge revealed, not invented. The Chinese spoke of the heavenly mandates carried on jade tablets. In the Americas, the Maya said their sacred calendar was given to them by beings who came from the stars. Everywhere we find the same image, wisdom descending from above, and in every tradition, that wisdom fades. The gods leave. The world resets. Humanity forgets. It's almost as if we are living in the long shadow of something that once was, a great civilization that rose, ruled, and fell long before recorded history. Perhaps the Sumerian King List wasn't the beginning of the story, but the middle, a record written by survivors who still remembered fragments of a time the rest of the world had already forgotten. Archaeology gives us glimpses, impossible structures that shouldn't exist, knowledge that arrived too early, alignments that defy coincidence. The pyramids of Egypt line up perfectly with the stars of Orion's belt, the temples of Angkor, what mirror the constellation Draco. The stones of Machu Picchu fit so precisely that even modern tools cannot replicate them. And scattered across the world, from Baalbek to Göbekli Tepe, we find ruins that seem to belong to an age when humans knew more than they should have. And yet, when we look for their origin, we always find the same story waiting. A great teacher, a lost kingdom, a flood and silence. So what are we really seeing? Are these the cultural coincidences of a species that thinks in patterns, or the remnants of a forgotten truth? Could the reason every civilization remembers the same beginning be because they all came from the same source? The Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven. The Egyptians said civilization came from the stars. The Maya said knowledge was brought by sky gods. The Greeks said Prometheus stole fire from the heavens. And even today, our religions still tell us that creation began with light, descending from above. Across thousands of years, we've changed the words, but not the story. Maybe that's why the King List still matters. Because when you strip away the names, languages, and geography, humanity's oldest memories all point in the same direction. Up, coincidence, or shared memory. The truth, whatever it is, seems older than any single civilization, deeper than any single faith. It whispers through every temple, every myth, every flood story, that once, long ago, something came down from the heavens and changed us forever. In the 1970s, one man dared to take the tablets literally. His name was Zecharia Sitchin, a linguist and independent researcher who claimed that scholars had missed the plain meaning of the Sumerian texts. Where others saw mythology, he said he saw history. Where others saw symbols, he said he saw engineering logs. His proposal was audacious. The gods of the Sumerians were not imaginary beings or poetic metaphors. They were an advanced, flesh and blood civilization from beyond Earth. Sitchin argued that the Sumerians described a 12th member of our solar system, counting the sun and moon. A wandering world they called Nibiru, the planet of the crossing. Unlike the familiar planets, Nibiru, he said, followed a huge elongated path, diving into the inner solar system roughly every 3,600 years, a sacred period the Sumerians also called a Sar. That number appears again and again in the King List. Reigns counted in multiples of 3,600, cosmic cycles measured like clockwork. To Sitchin, this was no coincidence. The gods' years were Nibiru years. The king's impossible lifespans were perfectly ordinary for beings born on a world with a different orbit and biology. Why would they come here? Not conquest, he said. Survival. According to his reading, Nibiru's atmosphere was failing. Its scientists discovered that a mist of micronized gold suspended high above the planet could repair the damage, reflecting and diffusing radiation the way a shield would. Gold, however, was scarce on Nibiru and abundant on Earth, so, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, launched a long-term, interplanetary mining mission. Sitchin places their first Earth base in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, a place the Sumerians called Eden, a word that sounds hauntingly like Eden. From there, he says they expanded operations, shipyards in the Persian Gulf, smelting and refining in cities like Bad Tibira, Fortress of the Smiths, landing zones in the highlands. The early mission ran on discipline and hierarchy, exactly what the King List describes. Kingship descended from heaven, which to Sitchin meant that command authority literally arrived from off-world and was delegated to appointed overseers. But minds are brutal. Eventually, the rank-and-file Anunnaki laborers rebelled. The texts, he claimed, call it a mutiny. Faced with collapse, the senior scientists proposed a radical fix: create a worker to bear the toil. Not from scratch, from Earth's most advanced hominin. Sitchin's reading of the Enki Ninhursag creation stories describes a genuine genetic project. Take the stock of Homo erectus, splice in Anunnaki DNA, carry the embryo in an Anunnaki surrogate, and birth a new being, Adamu, the Earthling, the first Homo sapiens. In this telling, our species did not slowly stumble into consciousness. We were upgraded for a purpose. We were upgraded for a purpose. From here, Sitchin says, everything in the Sumerian record starts to click into place. The sudden explosion of civilization is no longer a mystery. Its rollout, writing, a tool for logistics, mathematics, needed for surveying, astronomy, and scheduling launch windows, law, essential for controlling a mixed workforce. The ME, the divine decrees, read like modules of institutional software, kingship, priesthood, weaving, music, truth, even deceit, each a package of procedures handed to human administrators. The pre-flood kings, with their vast reigns, were not fairy tale elders, but long-lived supervisors enforcing policy during different phases: establishment in Eridu, metallurgy in Bad Tibira, planetary management in Larak, celestial science in Sipar, and finally Shurupak, the last hub before everything broke. Then came the catastrophe. In the standard myth, the gods decide mankind has become noisy, corrupt, uncontrollable. Enlil, the strict commander, demands a purge. Enki, the scientist and patron of humanity, dissents. He whispers to Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, to build a vast vessel to preserve life. Sitchin reframes this with technological edges. The flood, he suggests, was a predictable, perhaps cyclical, cataclysm triggered by climatic chaos during a Nibiru passage or by destabilized ice sheets. Whether allowed or engineered, it became a reset. When the waters fell, much of the Anunnaki mission wound down. Many gods departed. A few stayed to manage from afar through chosen bloodlines. Hybrids, kings, heroes with two-thirds divine ancestry. Gilgamesh's strange fraction suddenly reads like a laboratory note. In Sitchin's arc, post-flood kingship is a handover. The immortal supervisors are gone. The hybrid elites govern the new human world with shorter lives and limited authority. The old calendar remains, the old institutions persist, but the direct link is thinner, weaker. Every culture remembers the same thing. Once, the gods were here. After the flood, they were not. He takes the theory one step further, into our bodies. Why do myths obsess over royal blood? Why do lineages cling to the language of divine descent? Why do we tell stories of blue blood and heavenly seed? Fringe extensions of Sitchin's ideas point to genetic anomalies, like the RHS negative blood group, as potential traces of a non-human contribution. They point to clusters of unusual haplogroups, to cognitive leaps in the archaeological record, to the mystery of symbolic thought arriving almost overnight. None of this proves anything, but in the conspiratorial frame, it fits the narrative. We are the product of a project. The project left signatures. In the Sitchin timeline, several puzzle pieces align with an eerie neatness. The base 60 mathematics of Sumer, still used to count time and circles. The precision of early sky watching. The first time of Egypt's divine dynasties. India's Yuga cycles. China's mandate of heaven. Mesoamerica's star-born civilizers. The universal memory of a world-ending flood. All become chapters in a single administrative history. Even the King List's ledger tone makes a new kind of sense. It reads like operations, not myth. City, ruler, duration, transfer, repeat. And yet, there are hard questions. Astronomers have not verified a planet like Nibiru on a 3,600-year orbit slicing through the inner system. The dynamics are brutal. The perturbations on known planets would be noticeable, and modern surveys have found no such body where it would need to be. Planet 9 hypotheses exist, but those orbits sit far beyond Neptune and do not match Sitchin's passages. Geneticists, too, map a deep, tangled but terrestrial story. Homo sapiens emerges in Africa, mixes with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and expands with no need to invoke off-world edits. Archaeology shows innovation spurts, yes, but also long, patient chains of trial and error. And language scholars argue that many of Sitchin's translations are strained, poetic lines turned into technical manuals by choice, not necessity. There are cultural counters as well. Divine kingship can be propaganda, a way to sanctify power. Blood myths can reflect river civilizations traumatized by catastrophic inundations. Vast ages in king lists can encode symbolic cycles, not biological lifespans. The precision we admire in ancient sites may be the product of selection bias. We celebrate the alignments that amaze us and forget the ones that don't. But then the other side pushes back. Why do so many propagandas around the world converge on the same template? Why does the flood recur with such specific architecture? A worn survivor, a vessel, seed stock, a mountain landing, a bird released to test the waters. Why does the Sumerian record stitch impossible rains to verifiable names in one continuous voice? Why does civilization look not like a staircase, but like a switch? That's where Sitchin's theory lives, in the space between proofs and patterns. It is not established science, but it is not easily shrugged off either, because it gives a single, audacious explanation for anomalies that otherwise sit in separate drawers. It is, in a word, seductive. It makes the world coherent. Even within his framework, there is room for nuance. Perhaps there was no Nibiru, but there were teachers. Perhaps no genetic splice, but a concentrated transfer of knowledge that felt like magic. Perhaps the numbers are not lifespans, but eras of policy, measured in God years, because that is how the administrators thought. Perhaps the flood was neither divine wrath nor alien engineering, but a real geologic calamity that shattered a global network, leaving survivors with fragments that became our oldest truths. And yet, the emotional core remains the same, with or without spaceships. We live downstream from a break. Before it, the stories say we were closer to the sky, to eternity, to a pattern that made sense. After it, we are mortal, clever, anxious, building meaning brick by brick, the way Gilgamesh did when he returned to Uruk and touched his own walls. In that light, Sitchin's tale is less about aliens and more about memory. It says, our longing for the first time is not naive. It is ancestral. It says, our myths might be data compressed and corrupted, but still carrying a hint of source code. So where does that leave us? With two stories that will not merge. The first is the careful peer-reviewed account. Evolution, migration, domestication, cities, writing, law. The second is the thunderous cinematic arc. Descent, installation, kingship, flood, reset. One satisfies our demand for proof. The other satisfies our sense that the world is stranger than our measurements. Sitchin stands in that tension, pointing at the tablets and saying, "Take them at their word." Critics stand beside him, pointing at the sky and saying, "Show us the planet." Between them stretches the oldest question in human thought: how much of myth is memory and how much is dream? Perhaps the answer is simple. Perhaps the reason Sitchin's theory refuses to die is not because it is correct, but because it is complete. It ties together the King List, the epics, the flood, the stars, the sudden bloom of Sumer, the aching heart of Gilgamesh, and it leaves us with a feeling that the pieces finally fit. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But when we look at a small clay prism that coolly counts 200 years of kings before a single line of water erases the world, it is hard not to hear the echo of something we once knew. In the end, the theory leaves us where the tablets leave us, on the edge of certainty, staring at the gap between what is written and what is proved. It asks a question we can feel but cannot resolve. Are we the authors of our civilization, or the inheritors of a legacy installed long before we learned to write? The evidence is contested. The mystery is not, and that is why, even after the counter-arguments, even after the footnotes and the models and the measurements, the idea lingers like a star seen from the corner of the eye. It might be wrong. It might be myth. It might be both. But when you line up the cycles of 3,600 years, the cities named in sequence, the flood that resets the clock, the kings who are more than men, and the hero who cannot cross the last threshold, there is one final, unsettling truth left standing. It fits too well. What if the gods never truly left? What if they only changed form? The Sumerian King List may have ended thousands of years ago, but its legacy may still run through us, not only in our myths, but in our blood. For centuries, royal families across the world have claimed descent from divine beings. Pharaohs called themselves the sons of Ra. Chinese emperors ruled under the mandate of heaven. European monarchs declared themselves God's chosen. Even today, modern aristocracies speak of royal blood, as if it carries something sacred, something different. Why does this idea persist? Some researchers believe these beliefs are echoes, faint memories of a time when rulers truly were seen as more than human, hybrids of the divine and mortal. If the Anunnaki stories were literal, these early kings may have carried genetic traces of their creators, markers that once distinguished them from the rest of humanity. Over millennia, as those bloodlines blended with ordinary people, only fragments remained. Science gives us an intriguing coincidence. Around 15% of humans have a unique blood trait called Rh negative, a variation that can cause a mother's body to reject her unborn child if the father's blood is positive. It's a strange anomaly in evolution, one that seems to appear suddenly with no clear origin. Some see it as pure genetics. Others wonder if it could be a remnant of something not entirely human. Even if that theory is wrong, the idea itself reveals something deeper. We are haunted by a sense of separation, a feeling that we have lost contact with something higher, something that once walked among us. That longing has shaped every structure of human society. We still build hierarchies: kings, presidents, priests, corporations, each layer reflecting an ancient blueprint where power descends from above. Maybe that is the real inheritance of the gods, not in DNA, but in design. The way our societies still worship authority, the way we look up instead of across, the way we instinctively believe that truth must come from above. Every empire, every religion, every system of control may be an echo of the first one, the system that began when kingship descended from heaven. And then there is the spiritual legacy. The gods' departure left a hole no empire could fill. Every temple we build, every prayer we whisper, is an attempt to bridge that silence. Perhaps our need for gods, our endless search for meaning, our faith in something beyond ourselves, are all genetic memories of that lost connection. Maybe the Anunnaki didn't just shape us physically. Maybe they shaped our minds, programming into us a hunger to seek them again. That could explain why, even in the most modern age, we still look to the skies, still ask the same questions, still feel that strange nostalgia for a world we cannot remember. Perhaps we are not just descendants of the gods. Perhaps we are their unfinished project, still running, still evolving, still searching for the ones who built us. The Sumerian King List stands at the center of a mystery that refuses to fade. Written on a simple clay prism, it presents a story both impossible and undeniable. 8 kings ruling for 200 years. A flood that erased the world. A new humanity born from the mud. So what is it? Maybe it was propaganda. A political document designed to make a single Sumerian king appear legitimate, stretching his lineage back to the dawn of creation. In that case, the enormous reigns are symbols of cosmic authority, not calendars. Kingship descended from heaven simply means, I rule by divine right. Or maybe it was a misunderstood history, a real record of dynasties, each name representing an entire age or ruling house. The long numbers could mark eras, not lifetimes. The flood could have been a real Mesopotamian disaster that reset civilization, remembered as divine punishment. Or maybe, as Zechariah Sitchin and others dared to suggest, it was a record of contact, a literal account of a time when beings from another world governed Earth, taught humanity, and left behind the seeds of civilization. The prism would then be the first true history book, not of men, but of gods. We cannot prove any of these. But what makes the King List powerful is that all three might be true at once. It could be royal propaganda built upon fragments of real events, wrapped in a story of cosmic origin that our ancestors genuinely believed. In the end, the prism becomes a mirror, a kind of cosmic Rorschach test. What we see in its symbols depends on who we are. The skeptic sees myth, the historian sees allegory, the believer sees memory, but the question the King List asks is the same for everyone. Are you certain you know the whole story? It whispers that maybe history is not as simple as we think. Maybe there were ages before our age, civilizations before our civilization, worlds before our world. And perhaps the line between God and man, between myth and fact, is far thinner than we dare to admit. The 8 kings may be gone. Their cities lie buried beneath the sands of Iraq. But their story, impossible, defiant, eternal, has survived the flood, the fall of empires, and the forgetting of time. It remains, challenging us to look back and to look up, because somewhere in that line, carved into clay 4,000 years ago, may lie the first question humanity ever asked. Where did we come from? If you've come this far, thank you. You've journeyed through forgotten cities, walked beside ancient kings, and stared into the oldest mystery ever written. If you enjoyed exploring this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you believe. Was the Sumerian King List myth, memory, or message? Your support helps us bring more stories from the edge of history, mysteries that still shape our world today. Until next time, remember, history isn't finished. It's still being written, one rediscovery at a time. See you in the next one.